The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the village green of Street Mary Mead, where the annual summer fete had drawn its usual collection of well-meaning souls and competitive spirits. Bunting fluttered between the ancient oak trees, and the familiar sounds of polite disagreement over jam prizes drifted through the warm air like incense. It was the sort of perfectly ordinary English afternoon that, in Miss Jane Marple's considerable experience, often preceded the most extraordinary events. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore had surprised everyone by agreeing to host the garden party portion of the fete at her cottage, Rosemary Lodge. The widow, known for her meticulous habits and rather reclusive nature since her husband's passing 18 months prior, had been gradually emerging from her mourning. Her pristine cottage garden, with its prize-winning roses and precisely trimmed hedges, provided an elegant backdrop for the afternoon's festivities. Miss Marple, seated comfortably beneath a striped awning with her customary cup of tea, observed the gentle social warfare that accompanied such gatherings. She noted how Mrs. Bantry's eyes lingered enviously on Eleanor's hybrid tea roses, and how young Dr. Clement seemed rather more attentive to the widow than mere neighbourly concern might warrant. The vicar, Mr. Harwell, moved through the crowd with his usual earnest enthusiasm, while Mrs. Price Ridley held court near the cake stall with her characteristic authority. What caught Miss Marple's particular attention, however, was something that others seemed to overlook entirely. Mrs. Whitmore's garden gate, that wrought iron barrier she maintained with almost religious devotion, stood slightly ajar. It was such a small detail, yet Miss Marple had known Eleanor for years, and the woman was as particular about that gate as she was about her morning routine or her evening prayers. Peculiar, Miss Marple murmured to herself, setting down her teacup with deliberate care. Afternoon progressed with its usual rhythm of polite conversation and gentle competition. Eleanor moved gracefully among her guests, accepting compliments on her roses with modest pleasure. She wore a pale blue dress that complemented her silver hair, and seemed genuinely pleased to be entertaining again. Yet Miss Marple noticed how often the widow's gaze drifted toward that partially open gate, and how her smile occasionally faltered when she thought no one was watching. It was nearly 4 o'clock when Dr. Clement excused himself to retrieve his medical bag from his motor car, parked in the lane beyond the garden. The afternoon had grown warm, and several elderly guests were feeling the effects of the heat. He returned through the garden gate, which swung wider at his passage, and Miss Marple observed how he paused, frowning slightly at something beyond the hedge. "I say, Doctor," Clement called out, his voice carrying an odd note that made several heads turn. "Mrs. Whitmore, might I have a word?" Eleanor excused herself from a conversation about dahlia cultivation and walked toward the gate with her characteristic measured steps. Miss Marple watched as the doctor spoke quietly, urgently, and saw the color drain from Eleanor's face. The widow's hand flew to her throat, and she swayed slightly before steadying herself against the gatepost. "Whatever is the matter?" called Mrs. Bantry, always quick to sense drama. Dr. Clement's expression was grave as he addressed the assembled guests. "I'm afraid there's been an accident. We shall need to telephone for the police immediately." The cheerful sounds of the fete died away, as if someone had turned down the volume on a wireless. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair, her keen eyes taking in every face, every reaction. In her experience, the most revealing moments came not in what people said, but in what they didn't say, and how they looked when they thought no one was watching. The gate, still ajar, creaked softly in the sudden silence. The cheerful murmur of the garden party died as completely as if someone had drawn a curtain across the afternoon. Dr. Clement emerged from beyond the hedge, his face grave, brushing a sprig of rosemary from his sleeve. Behind him, through the partially open gate that had so troubled Miss Marple's sense of order, lay the still form of a gentleman in a dark suit. "I'm afraid it's Mr. Lionel Westcott, Dr. Clement announced quietly to the assembled guests. "The antique dealer from Much Benham. He appears to have suffered some kind of accident." A collective intake of breath rippled through the gathering. Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to be caught without an opinion, stepped forward with her parasol planted firmly before her. "Westcott? But whatever was he doing here? This is hardly the time for business calls." Eleanor Whitmore's face had gone quite pale, her hands clasping and unclasping at her sides. He had written requesting an appointment," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told him today would not be suitable. What with the fete? I specifically suggested he call tomorrow morning instead." "Then why did he come?" Mrs. Bantry demanded, her eyes bright with the peculiar excitement that accompanies unexpected drama. Surely he wouldn't ignore such clear instructions. Miss Marple observed this exchange from her position beneath the awning, noting how Eleanor's gaze kept drifting toward the gate as if drawn by some invisible thread. The widow stood with her back partially turned to the lane, almost as though she were shielding the other guests from the sight beyond, yet her posture suggested she was acutely aware of what lay there. The sound of bicycle wheels on gravel announced the arrival of P.C. Lake, the village constable, who appeared flushed and somewhat overwhelmed by the sudden importance of his position. He propped his bicycle against the garden wall and approached the gate with the careful dignity of a man, conscious of his duty. "Now then," he said, consulting a small notebook with great ceremony. "I'll need everyone to remain where they are until I've had a proper look. Dr. Clement, if you'd show me." As the two men disappeared beyond the hedge, the remaining guests began to cluster in small groups, their voices dropping to the hushed tones reserved for momentous occasions. The theories began almost immediately, each person offering their own explanation with the confidence of those who had never encountered violent death. "Heat stroke, most likely," suggested the vicar's wife, fanning herself nervously. "Such a warm afternoon, and gentlemen of a certain age." "Nonsense," interrupted Mrs. Price Ridley. "Westcott was as strong as an ox. I've seen him carry furniture that would challenge men half his age. No, mark my words, this was no natural occurrence." Miss Marple found herself studying the faces around her with renewed interest. She noticed how Dr. Clement, upon his return from examining the scene, kept glancing toward Eleanor with an expression that mingled professional concern with something more personal. The young doctor's hands, she observed, bore faint traces of green paint that matched the fresh coating on Eleanor's gatepost. "Was there any sign of foul play, Mrs. Bantry inquired, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. P.C. Lake cleared his throat importantly. "I've telephoned for Inspector Craddock from the county police. Until he arrives, I must ask that no one disturb the scene or leave the premises." Eleanor's reaction to this announcement was subtle but telling. Her shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly, and Miss Marple noticed how the widow's fingers worried at the clasp of her handbag, a small, unconscious gesture that spoke of nerves stretched taut. "But surely," Eleanor said, her voice carefully controlled, "if it was simply an accident, there's no need for such official proceedings." The question hung in the air, and like smoke, and Miss Marple found herself wondering why a woman whose property had been the scene of an unfortunate incident would be so reluctant to have the matter thoroughly investigated. In her considerable experience, innocent people generally welcomed official confirmation of their innocence. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the festive bunting fluttered mockingly in the breeze, Miss Marple reflected on the curious circumstances that had transformed a pleasant garden party into something altogether more sinister. There was the matter of the gate, left ajar by a woman known for her meticulous habits. There was Mr. Westcott's unexpected arrival, despite clear instructions to the contrary. And there was Eleanor's barely concealed anxiety, which seemed to extend far beyond the natural distress of discovering death on one's doorstep. The old detective settled back in her chair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked. In her experience, the most revealing truths often emerged not in the first moments of shock, but in the quiet spaces between words, where people forgot to guard their expressions and their secrets began to show. The arrival of Inspector Craddock brought a welcome sense of official authority to the increasingly tense atmosphere at Rosemary Lodge. Miss Marple had encountered the inspector on previous occasions and found him to be a thorough man, though perhaps inclined to pursue the most obvious path when subtler truths lay hidden beneath the surface. He stepped from his motor car with characteristic briskness, his keen eyes already assessing the scene with professional detachment. After a brief consultation with P.C. Lake and Dr. Clement, Inspector Craddock addressed the assembled guests with measured courtesy. The cheerful bunting still fluttered overhead, a mockingly festive backdrop to the proceedings that had transformed an innocent garden party into something far more sinister. "I understand this has been a distressing interruption to your afternoon," the inspector began. "Before I speak with each of you individually, I should mention that we discovered a brown paper parcel beside Miss Westcott, addressed to Mrs. Whitmore." Eleanor's reaction was swift and telling. "A parcel?" Her voice barely wavered, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening around her eyes. "I wasn't expecting anything." "Perhaps," Inspector Craddock suggested gently, "it contained the items Mr. Westcott hoped to purchase?" "Possibly," Eleanor replied, though her fingers worried at her handbag clasp with renewed intensity. "He had written about some pieces from my late husband's collection, silver items, a few books, nothing of particular significance." Miss Marple found this exchange illuminating. Eleanor's responses came too quickly, too neatly packaged, as if she had rehearsed them. The widow's gaze kept drifting toward the house, and there was something in her manner that suggested she knew more about that parcel than she cared to admit. Inspector Craddock's methodical questioning soon revealed information that cast the afternoon's events in a different light. Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to withhold an opinion, declared that Westcott had been making the rounds of local households, always persistent about items he wished to acquire. "He called on me just last week," Mrs. Bantry added, her indignation still fresh, "quite insistent about a set of china that belonged to my grandmother. When I declined, he suggested I might reconsider given my circumstances." Her cheeks flushed with remembered offense. This revelation caused Miss Marple to reassess what she knew of Eleanor's situation. She had observed the subtle signs of financial constraint that had appeared since Charles Whitmore's death: the carefully mended gloves, the less frequent shopping expeditions, the practical vegetables that had replaced ornamental flowers in several garden beds. Dr. Clement stepped forward, his medical bag still in hand. "Inspector, I should mention that there's green paint on Mr. Westcott's jacket sleeve, similar to what I got on my hands from the gate. He must have brushed against the fresh coating." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. The gate that had troubled her sense of order was now implicated by physical evidence. She noticed, too, a faint dusting of white chalk on Eleanor's hem, the kind that marked the lane where Westcott had fallen. "Mrs. Whitmore," Inspector Craddock continued, "you mentioned that Mr. Westcott had written requesting an appointment. When exactly did you receive his letter?" "3 days ago," Eleanor replied promptly, then seemed to realize the implication. "Rather short notice, I thought. But antique dealers can be eager." Miss Marple reflected on this timeline. 3 days was indeed hasty for someone as methodical as Eleanor, who planned her social calendar with military precision. Most reputable dealers worked around their clients' schedules rather than forcing urgent meetings. As the inspector continued his preliminary interviews, Miss Marple observed the interplay of personalities with growing interest. Eleanor's anxiety seemed to extend beyond natural distress at discovering death on her property. Dr. Clement positioned himself protectively near the widow, while the other guests divided between those who found the proceedings thrillingly dramatic and those genuinely disturbed by the turn of events. The afternoon shadows were lengthening now, casting the abandoned fete decorations in an increasingly melancholy light. Miss Marple settled back in her chair, her sharp eyes missing nothing as the official investigation began to unfold around the mystery of why Lionel Westcott had died in a lane beside a gate that should have been properly closed. Inspector Craddock's examination of the scene beyond the hedge revealed details that transformed speculation into something more concrete. Mr. Westcott lay partially on his side, his bowler hat having rolled several feet away. The brown paper parcel rested against the low stone wall, positioned with an almost deliberate care that seemed inconsistent with a sudden collapse. Dr. Clement pointed out the injuries with professional precision. There's bruising at the back of the head, and this graze along the temple suggests contact with a hard surface. The green paint on his sleeve and knuckles indicates he grasped or brushed against the freshly painted gatepost. His pocket watch stopped at 23 minutes past 12. Inspector Craddock observed, carefully noting the time. This placed Westcott's arrival well before the fete guests had begun gathering, contradicting Eleanor's assertion that she had discouraged his visit. With Eleanor's reluctant permission, P.C. Lake carefully unwrapped the mysterious parcel. Inside lay an elegant Georgian silver photograph frame, its back panel loose as though recently opened. The velvet backing bore the dusty outline of something rectangular that had been removed, and tucked beneath was a folded sheet of Westcott's business letterhead, completely blank. Eleanor's reaction was swift and telling. "I don't recognize it," she said, then added with suspicious haste, "Charles had no interest in such ornamental pieces." Miss Marple, observing from her position near the tea table, found this claim curious. Charles Whitmore had been known for his appreciation of fine things, and their home displayed numerous decorative objects. She also detected a faint odor of turpentine drifting from the direction of the kitchen door, oddly out of place at a garden party. Inspector Craddock's questioning grew more pointed. "Mrs. Whitmore, you mentioned destroying Mr. Westcott's letter. Might I ask why?" "There was nothing of consequence in it," Eleanor replied, her fingers working nervously at her handbag clasp. "He wished to view some items from Charles's collection, silver spoons, a first edition Tennyson. I told him today was unsuitable." Miss Marple noted this with interest. Eleanor was famously economical, reusing envelopes and writing shopping lists on the backs of circulars. Destroying correspondence seemed entirely out of character for such a frugal household manager. The vicar, summoned to provide his observations, recalled seeing Westcott near the post office at 10 minutes past 12, walking briskly toward the lane with the parcel under his arm. "He appeared quite pleased about something," Mr. Harwell added, then colored as if finding satisfaction inappropriate given the circumstances. Mrs. Bantry confirmed another sighting. "I saw him examining our sundial at 12:30. Then he continued toward Rosemary Lodge. He certainly didn't appear unwell or distressed." As Inspector Craddock examined the gate more closely, he noted how the fresh green paint had been disturbed in several places. P.C. Lake, testing the mechanism, discovered that the gate's spring latch was designed to close automatically, but could be held ajar by the slightest pressure. "You mentioned propping it open while the paint dried," the inspector said to Eleanor. "Yes, just slightly. The morning air helps it cure properly." Eleanor's voice remained steady, but Miss Marple observed a thin red mark on the widow's wrist that might have been caused by garden thorns or by string pulled too tightly and hastily removed. Inside the house, Miss Marple glimpsed a small tin of green paint on the hall table, its lid askew and brush abandoned on newspaper. The crossword bore several neatly completed squares in Eleanor's precise handwriting. More significantly, Eleanor's handbag clasp bore a small smear of the same green paint, the sort of mark made by handling the bag with paint-stained fingers. The accumulated evidence painted an increasingly clear picture, yet Miss Marple sensed undercurrents that the obvious facts failed to explain. Eleanor's anxiety seemed to extend beyond natural distress at discovering death on her property. There was something almost desperate in her manner, as if she were protecting more than just her reputation. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the abandoned fete decorations fluttered mockingly in the breeze, Inspector Craddock appeared satisfied with the direction his investigation was taking. The physical evidence, the suspicious timing, and Eleanor's evasive responses were building a compelling case against the widow. But Miss Marple, clicking her knitting needles thoughtfully, remained unconvinced that the most obvious solution would prove to be the correct one. The lengthening shadows and cooling air prompted Inspector Craddock to move the investigation indoors, where the orderly comfort of Rosemary Lodge's drawing room provided a stark contrast to the chaos that had engulfed the afternoon. Eleanor sat rigidly on the edge of her chintz sofa, her untouched teacup growing cold, while Dr. Clement positioned himself near the mantelpiece with the protective stance of a guardian rather than a mere neighbor. Miss Marple, invited to rest in a corner armchair as a concession to her age, found herself in the perfect position to observe the subtle interplay of personalities under stress. The faint smell of turpentine still lingered in the air, mixing oddly with the usual scents of beeswax polish and dried lavender that characterized Eleanor's meticulous housekeeping. The arrival of Florrie, the young maid, brought unexpected illumination to the morning's events. She entered nervously, carrying a fresh tea tray and casting anxious glances between her employer and the inspector. "Florrie," Inspector Craddock said gently, "I understand you painted the gate this morning." The girl nodded, her hands twisting in her apron. "Yes, sir. Mrs. Whitmore asked me to touch up the gatepost on account of the fate. The paint was that sticky, though, and I said as how it should be propped open to dry proper." "And how did you manage that?" Craddock inquired. "I tied it with string to the latch. But Mrs. Whitmore cut it off after her errand to the post. Said the draught made the napkins blow about." Florrie's voice dropped to a whisper. "I swept the bits into the dustpan." "I did." Miss Marple observed Eleanor's reaction with interest. The widow's fingers had resumed their nervous manipulation of her handbag clasp, and there was something almost desperate in the way she avoided meeting the maid's eyes. P.C. Lake, dispatched to examine the scullery bin, returned with a handful of green-stained twine and something else that made Inspector Craddock pause the stub of a candle. Its wick bent sideways as if extinguished in haste. "Curious items to find in a kitchen bin," the inspector observed. "Mrs. Whitmore, can you explain their presence?" Eleanor's composure showed the first real signs of cracking. "Aye. The candle was from Charles's study. I was sorting through his papers this morning and found it among his things. As for the string," Florrie explained that. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to movement near the rose bushes visible through the window. A small tabby cat emerged from beneath the garden shed, carrying something in its mouth. Rising with the careful movements of age, she approached the window and noted where the creature deposited its prize before disappearing again. "Such interesting creatures, cats," she murmured to herself, then addressed Florrie. "My dear, might I trouble you for a glass of water? The afternoon has been rather warm." As Florrie hurried to comply, Miss Marple stepped outside briefly, ostensibly for air. Near the rose bushes, half hidden beneath a fallen petal, lay a small brass key of old-fashioned design. Its surface bore fingerprint smudges and, more intriguingly, traces of red sealing wax. She palmed it quietly, her knitting bag providing convenient concealment. Returning inside, Miss Marple found Dr. Clement answering questions about his movements that morning. As he shifted position, a small metallic click emanated from his jacket pocket, causing his eyes to flick downward in quick denial. "You mentioned visiting Much Benham professionally," Inspector Craddock noted. "Did you know Mr. Westcott personally?" "Only in passing," Dr. Clement replied, too carefully. "He had a clerk with recurring bronchitis. Nothing more than professional courtesy." Miss Marple found this evasiveness curious, particularly given the protective stance he maintained toward Eleanor. There was something in his manner that suggested a more complex relationship with both the victim and the widow than mere neighborly concern. The brass key in her knitting bag felt warm against her fingers, and she considered its implications. Eleanor had mentioned Charles's writing desk among the items Westcott wished to purchase. Such desks typically contained numerous small drawers and compartments, many secured with keys exactly like the one she had discovered. The red sealing wax suggested something had been deliberately locked away, then recently accessed. Inspector Craddock's questioning grew more pointed as he addressed the timeline discrepancies. "Mr. Westcott's watch stopped at 23 minutes past 12. Yet witnesses place him at various locations throughout the noon hour. Even allowing for village timekeeping variations, there's a troubling gap. Eleanor's response came too quickly. Village clocks are notoriously unreliable. The church bell runs fast, the sundial is wrong by several minutes in summer. Quite true, Miss Marple agreed mildly. Though pocket watches tend to be more dependable than sundials, don't they? Unless, of course, they're deliberately stopped. The comment hung in the air like incense, and Miss Marple noted how Eleanor's knuckles whitened as she gripped her handbag more tightly. Dr. Clement cleared his throat unnecessarily, and even Florrie seemed to sense the tension that had suddenly thickened the atmosphere. As Inspector Craddock prepared to conclude the afternoon's questioning, Miss Marple reflected on the accumulating evidence. The physical clues painted a compelling picture, but there were undercurrents she sensed but couldn't yet articulate. Eleanor's desperation seemed to extend beyond mere guilt, and Dr. Clement's protective behavior suggested knowledge he was reluctant to share. The brass key in her possession might well prove to be the missing piece of a puzzle that was far more complex than a simple case of financial desperation leading to violence. The evening shadows had begun to gather when Inspector Craddock announced his intention to examine Charles Whitmore's study, the room Eleanor had mentioned while explaining the mysterious candle stub. Eleanor's reaction was swift and telling a sharp intake of breath, followed by an almost involuntary step backward, as if the inspector had suggested violating sacred ground. "Surely that's unnecessary," she protested, her voice carrying a note of desperation that hadn't been present earlier. "Charles has been gone 18 months. There's nothing in his study that could possibly relate to today's unfortunate incident." Miss Marple observed this exchange with growing interest, particularly noting how Dr. Clement moved closer to Eleanor's side, his protective instincts clearly aroused. The brass key in her knitting bag seemed to pulse with significance, and she found herself wondering what secrets Charles Whitmore's methodical mind had locked away. Nevertheless, Inspector Craddock replied with quiet authority, "A thorough investigation requires examining all areas where evidence might be found. You mentioned sorting through your late husband's papers this morning, which suggests the room remains in active use." Eleanor's fingers worked frantically at her handbag clasp, the same nervous gesture Miss Marple had observed throughout the afternoon. "Of course," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "though I'm afraid you'll find nothing but dusty old books and household accounts." The study, when they entered it, bore the musty scent of a room sealed against grief rather than open to memory. Heavy velvet curtains blocked most of the remaining daylight, and Charles's imposing mahogany writing desk dominated one corner, its numerous small drawers and compartments speaking to the methodical nature of its former owner. Miss Marple cleared her throat delicately. "Inspector, I wonder if this might be of assistance." She produced the brass key she had discovered among the rose bushes, its surface still bearing traces of red sealing wax. "I found it in the garden earlier. It appears to be quite old." Eleanor's face went ashen. I have no idea how that came to be there." The key fit perfectly into the central drawer's lock, turning with the smooth precision of frequent use. Inside lay an orderly collection of documents that painted a disturbing picture of the months preceding Charles Whitmore's death. A leather-bound ledger revealed regular payments to L.W. spanning nearly 2 years, the amounts gradually increasing before ceasing abruptly 3 months ago. "Blackmail," Inspector Craddock said grimly, his finger tracing the neat columns of figures. "These payments correspond exactly with your household's financial difficulties, Mrs. Whitmore." Eleanor sank into a nearby chair, her composure finally cracking completely. Charles discovered that Westcott had been acquiring items from grieving families under false pretenses. When he threatened to expose him, Westcott produced certain photographs, documents from Charles's past that would have ruined his reputation in the community. Clement stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Eleanor, you don't have to explain anything. Charles was protecting his family's honor, and Westcott was nothing but a common criminal. Miss Marple noted the passionate defense and the intimate use of Eleanor's Christian name. The relationship between the widow and the young doctor was clearly more complex than simple neighborly concern. Further examination of the desk revealed a small compartment that had been recently opened, its lock showing fresh scratches that matched the brass key perfectly. Inside, they found the remnants of red sealing wax and a few fragments of what appeared to be old correspondence, deliberately torn into pieces too small to be readable. The photograph frame, Miss Marple murmured, understanding beginning to dawn. It wasn't what Westcott wanted to sell, was it, my dear? It was what he was returning, or rather, what he was using to demonstrate that he still possessed the original. Eleanor's silence was answer enough. Inspector Craddock discovered one final piece of evidence in the fireplace, grate a half-burned letter bearing Westcott's letterhead, its surviving fragments mentioning final arrangements and Thursday afternoon payment. As the inspector concluded his examination, Miss Marple reflected on the intricate web of secrets and desperation that had led to the afternoon's tragic events. The brass key had indeed unlocked more than just a drawer. It had revealed the human motivations that drove people to desperate acts when their carefully constructed lives were threatened. Eleanor's confession, when it came, was delivered in the flat, exhausted tone of someone who had carried a burden too heavy for too long. I stopped the payments 3 months ago when the money simply ran out. When Westcott threatened to make everything public, I couldn't let Charles's memory be destroyed by that man's greed. Clement's protective stance intensified, and Miss Marple found herself wondering just how much the young doctor knew about the morning's events, and how far his devotion to Eleanor might have led him to go in protecting her from Westcott's persistent demands. The truth, she suspected, was more complicated than a simple case of financial desperation leading to violence, and the brass key she had discovered was merely the first of several locks that would need to be opened before the full story could be revealed. Eleanor's confession seemed to settle like dust in the study's heavy air. Yet Miss Marple sensed something incomplete in the widow's account. Inspector Craddock, methodical as always, was examining the contents of Charles's desk when P.C. Lake appeared in the doorway, slightly breathless from his exertions. "Inspector," Lake announced, "I've found Mr. Westcott's motorcar parked down the lane, and there's something you should see." He produced a small leather-bound diary, its pages filled with neat handwriting. This was tucked under the seat. Craddock accepted the diary with interest, flipping through its pages with growing attention. "Most illuminating," he murmured. "It appears Mr. Westcott had quite a busy schedule today. Beyond his appointment with Mrs. Whitmore, he had noted 11 a.m. Mrs. Bantry, China valuation, and 2 p.m. Dr. Clement Medical Instruments consultation. The effect of these revelations was immediate and telling. Mrs. Bantry, who had lingered near the doorway with the other guests, flushed crimson and began fanning herself vigorously. Dr. Clement's protective stance toward Eleanor faltered as his face went pale, then flushed with what appeared to be guilt rather than indignation. "A consultation?" Eleanor repeated, turning to the young doctor with surprise. "You never mentioned any business with Mr. Westcott." Before Dr. Clement could respond, the telephone's shrill ring interrupted the tense moment. P.C. Lake answered with officious importance, his brief conversation punctuated by increasingly grave expressions. When he replaced the receiver, his announcement fell like a stone into still water. "Inspector, that was the station. They've confirmed Dr. Clement's morning appointments in Much Benham. Mrs. Henderson says he never called, and Mr. Pembroke wasn't expecting him until tomorrow." The silence that followed was profound. Dr. Clement's carefully constructed alibi crumbled visibly, his face cycling through embarrassment, defiance, and finally resignation. Eleanor's eyes widened with what appeared to be genuine shock, suggesting that whatever understanding existed between them hadn't included coordinated deception. "I can explain," Dr. Clement began, then stopped abruptly as footsteps approached from the hall. A thin young man with hollow cheeks appeared, shepherded by another constable who had been stationed outside. "Found him trying the garden gate," the constable reported. "Says he's from Much Benham." The newcomer tugged nervously at his cap. "Edgar Pike, sir. I work for Mr. Westcott. He told me to collect a parcel if he hadn't returned by 2 o'clock. His gaze fixed on the brown paper package that still rested on the sideboard. "Said people sometimes get nervous about old arrangements." Miss Marple observed Pike's testimony with particular interest, noting how his innocent words seemed to strike Dr. Clement like physical blows. The young assistant's next revelation proved even more damaging. "I've seen you before," Pike said, pointing at Dr. Clement with the fearless directness of youth. "At the shop last week, asking about papers Mr. Westcott had taken for valuation. Said it was for a patient's peace of mind." Dr. Clement's composure cracked completely. "I was trying to protect Eleanor," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "When I learned what that man was doing to her family, I couldn't stand by and watch." Eleanor rose from her chair with sudden determination, her face showing not gratitude but horror. "No," she said firmly. "This has gone far enough. You mustn't say another word." Inspector Craddock's attention sharpened as he noticed Dr. Clement's hand moving instinctively to his jacket pocket, where something clinked softly against the buttons. The sound had been present throughout the afternoon, Miss Marple recalled, but now it seemed to carry ominous significance. "I'm afraid," the inspector said with quiet authority. "That decision is no longer yours to make, Mrs. Whitmore. Dr. Clement, I must ask you to empty your pockets." Miss Marple reflected on the expanding web of deception as the young doctor reluctantly reached into his jacket. The diary had revealed that Westcott's predatory business extended far beyond simple blackmail, encompassing financial vulnerabilities throughout the village. The brass key had unlocked one set of secrets, but it appeared there were others yet to be discovered. As the investigation deepened, she found herself wondering which of the accumulating suspects had finally decided that Lionel Westcott's exploitation had gone far enough. Dr. Clement's reluctant compliance with Inspector Craddock's request produced a collection of items that transformed the afternoon's investigation entirely. His trembling hands first withdrew a railway ticket stub to Much Benham dated that morning, its edges worn from nervous handling. Following this came a small brass screw, no larger than a shirt button, which rolled across Charles Whitmore's polished desk with a tiny metallic sound that seemed to echo in the heavy silence. "And this?" Inspector Craddock inquired, lifting the screw with careful precision. Dr. Clement's face had gone ashen. It must have fallen into my pocket at Westcott's shop." He was demonstrating how easily the backs of old frames could be removed for cleaning or repair. "Such a small thing. I hardly noticed." Edgar Pike leaned forward with the eager attention of youth. "That's one of ours. Right enough," he declared with unmistakable certainty. "Mr. Westcott keeps a tin of them on his workbench, but he'd never send a parcel with loose fittings, particular as clockwork. He is about such things." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythmic clicking. "How very sensible," she observed gently. "Loose fastenings do invite such inconvenience. Things slip in and out so easily when the mechanisms aren't properly secured." Eleanor's reaction was swift and telling a sharp intake of breath, followed by a searching look at Dr. Clement that seemed to reassess everything she thought she knew about his morning activities. The railway ticket lying among his possessions contradicted his earlier claims about professional visits, creating a web of deception that grew more complex with each revelation. Inspector Craddock turned his attention to the brown paper parcel, examining its neat address label with renewed interest. "Mrs. Whitmore, you mentioned that you never addressed this parcel. Yet someone clearly took care to ensure proper delivery." He passed the package to Edgar Pike, whose examination proved illuminating. "That's not Mr. Westcott's hand," the young assistant declared without hesitation. "He writes round letters, old-fashioned style. This is sharper, more precise, like a lady's penmanship." The collective silence that followed this observation was profound. Eleanor's fingers had resumed their nervous manipulation of her handbag clasp, while Dr. Clement appeared to be struggling with some internal conflict between protection and truth. Miss Marple cleared her throat delicately. "Florrie, my dear," she called to the maid who hovered anxiously in the doorway, "when you noticed the parcel on the hall table this morning, did it already bear Mrs. Whitmore's name?" Florrie nodded hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, miss. Before the fete proper began. The writing looked like Mrs. Whitmore's, if you don't mind me saying. She told me not to fuss with it." Eleanor's composure showed signs of serious strain. "I may have tidied the address," she admitted reluctantly. "When one maintains a household, small improvements become quite automatic. I hardly thought." "Of course not," Miss Marple agreed with gentle understanding. "Such natural instincts for order, though it does raise the question of what the parcel contained when it arrived, and what it might contain now." Dr. Clement's protective instincts finally overcame his discretion. "Eleanor had nothing to do with Westcott's death," he declared with passionate conviction. "I was trying to intercept him before he could make more demands, before he could destroy what remained of Charles's reputation with his threats and manipulations." Inspector Craddock studied the railway ticket with methodical attention. "Yet this ticket indicates you travelled to Much Benham this morning, contradicting your earlier statement about local appointments. What was the true purpose of your journey, Doctor?" The young physician's carefully constructed facade crumbled visibly. "I went to reason with him, to appeal to whatever decency might remain in the man." Westcott had been systematically exploiting grieving families throughout the district, using their vulnerability for his own profit. Miss Marple observed these revelations with growing interest, though something in Dr. Clement's manner continued to trouble her experienced eye. His desperation seemed genuine enough, yet there remained an element of performance in his protective declarations that didn't quite align with the careful staging of evidence they had discovered. The brass screw resting on Charles's desk seemed to pulse with significance, suggesting connections between Westcott's shop, the mysterious parcel, and the complex web of relationships that bound the village together. As Inspector Craddock prepared to delve deeper into these connections, Miss Marple found herself wondering whether the truth lay not in any single person's guilt, but in the intricate dance of secrets and loyalties that Westcott's predatory behavior had set into motion. The afternoon shadows continued to lengthen, and with them came the growing certainty that the real revelation was yet to come. The brass screw gleaming on Charles Whitmore's desk held everyone's attention, yet Miss Marple found herself studying something far more intriguing: the careful penmanship on the brown paper parcel's address label. She rose slowly from her chair, her knitting needles clicking with thoughtful rhythm as she approached Inspector Craddock. "Might I examine that address once more?" she requested gently. The inspector obliged, and she studied the neat script with the mild curiosity of someone accustomed to observing life's small details. "Such precise lettering," she murmured, the long horizontal stroke crossing both T's in Whitmore with one firm line, the restrained loop of the capital W. "Rather reminds me of the notices posted on the church door for parish events." Mrs. Harwell, who had slipped into the study unnoticed during the commotion, colored slightly at this observation. "I do prepare the parish notices," she admitted with careful dignity. "Legible handwriting is essential for church communications, but I certainly haven't addressed any parcels today." "Of course not, my dear," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, "though one does notice that red sealing wax has such a tendency to leave traces on everything it touches. Fingers, clothing, even handbag clasps when one isn't careful." Inspector Craddock's attention sharpened as he observed Mrs. Harwell's unconscious glance toward her own hands. "P.C. Lake mentioned you posted a registered letter this afternoon, Mrs. Harwell. Might I inquire about its destination?" "Parish business," she replied too quickly. "Quarterly accounts to our solicitors in London." The vicar relies on my attention to such details, as I'm sure you understand. Edgar Pike, still hovering near the doorway with the eager attention of youth, suddenly straightened with recognition. Begging your pardon, ma'am, but Mr. Westcott mentioned expecting correspondence about the vicarage matter today. Said it was urgent business that couldn't wait. The effect of this revelation rippled through the assembled group like a stone dropped into still water. Eleanor's face showed genuine surprise, while Dr. Clement's protective stance faltered as he realized the investigation was expanding beyond his ability to control or deflect. Miss Marple returned to her examination of the photograph frame, her practiced fingers tracing the edges where the backing had been disturbed. "Dr. Clement," she said conversationally, "when you handled this frame at Mr. Westcott's shop, did you notice anything unusual about its contents?" The young doctor's face cycled through confusion, then understanding, then something approaching panic. There were papers inside. Old correspondence. Westcott claimed they were evidence of improprieties, but I thought them merely private letters of no real consequence. "Ah," Miss Marple nodded with gentle understanding. "Yet you felt compelled to examine them closely enough to disturb the frame's mechanism. The brass screw in your pocket suggests rather thorough investigation." Eleanor's composure finally cracked as she grasped the implications. "What papers?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What did that man have?" Dr. Clement's protective instincts overcame his discretion entirely. "Nothing that could truly harm you," he declared with passionate conviction. "Old letters from before your marriage to Charles. Westcott was using them to exploit your sense of propriety, threatening to reveal private correspondence that any reasonable person would consider perfectly innocent." Inspector Craddock studied the railway ticket with renewed interest. "Yet you purchased this ticket yesterday, Doctor, suggesting premeditation. You intended to confront Westcott at his shop, not merely intercept him here." The admission that followed transformed everyone's understanding of the morning's events. Dr. Clement had indeed travelled to Much Benham, not to appeal to Westcott's better nature, but to demand the return of all materials related to Eleanor's past. When Westcott refused, claiming he had already dispatched the most damaging evidence to interested parties, Dr. Clement had attempted to prevent the delivery by following him back to Street Mary Mead. The parcel was supposed to contain proof of Eleanor's indiscretions. "Dr. Clement continued, his voice thick with emotion, "but when I examined it after the accident, I found only an empty frame and blank letterhead. Westcott had been bluffing, using fear and suggestion rather than actual evidence." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused as she absorbed this revelation. "How curious," she observed mildly. "Yet Mrs. Harwell posted urgent correspondence to London solicitors this very afternoon. One wonders whether Mr. Westcott's bluff might have been more substantial than you realize, Doctor." Mrs. Harwell's fingers worked nervously at her gloves, while Eleanor sat frozen with the terrible realization that her secrets might be far from safe. Inspector Craddock closed his notebook with decisive authority. "I believe," he announced, "that we need to examine exactly what correspondence left Street Mary Mead today, and what Mr. Westcott might have discovered about the private affairs of our village residents." As the investigation prepared to take yet another unexpected turn, Miss Marple reflected on the intricate web of secrets and desperation that seemed to connect far more people than anyone had initially suspected. The brass screw had indeed unlocked more than just a frame. It had revealed the complex motivations that drove people to extraordinary measures when their carefully constructed lives were threatened by a predator like Lionel Westcott. The truth, she suspected, would prove to be more complicated than any single act of desperation, involving the collective weight of secrets that Westcott had accumulated through his systematic exploitation of human vulnerability. The evening shadows had begun to gather when P.C. Lake returned from the post office, his face bearing the satisfied expression of a man who had uncovered significant evidence. Behind him walked Mrs. Fallon, the postmistress, whose indignation at being summoned from her duties was tempered by obvious curiosity about the proceedings at Rosemary Lodge. Inspector P.C. Lake announced with barely contained excitement, "The evening postal collection hasn't departed yet. Mrs. Fallon has been most cooperative in retrieving the registered correspondence." Mrs. Harwell's face went ashen as Inspector Craddock accepted a manila envelope bearing the London solicitor's address in her distinctive handwriting. The same precise penmanship that Miss Marple had observed on the brown paper parcel now seemed to pulse with significance under the study's lamplight. "With your permission, Mrs. Harwell," Inspector Craddock said with quiet authority, though his tone suggested the permission was merely a courtesy. The envelope's contents proved illuminating beyond expectation, a banker's draft for a substantial sum, a typed covering letter on vicarage stationery, and a small, folded slip that fell onto Charles Whitmore's desk with the whisper of damning evidence. Edgar Pike leaned forward with the eager attention of youth. "That's a pawn ticket from American Sons," he declared with unmistakable certainty. "Mr. Westcott did business with them, regular-like. Said they were reliable for quick transactions when clients needed immediate funds." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythmic clicking as she observed Mrs. Harwell's reaction to this revelation. The vicar's wife sat frozen, her usual air of parish authority replaced by something approaching desperation. Her hands, which had maintained their nervous grip on her reticule throughout the afternoon, now trembled visibly. "The candlesticks," Mrs. Harwell whispered, her voice barely audible above the study's heavy silence. "Georgian silver from the church altar. My husband needed specialist treatment in London, and there simply wasn't money in the parish funds, I thought. I hoped it would be temporary, that no one would notice their absence during the summer months, when services are less formal." Inspector Craddock examined the pawn ticket with methodical attention. Yet Mr. Westcott discovered their absence during his valuation of the church plate. He was supposed to be cataloguing items for insurance purposes. Mrs. Harwell continued, her composure cracking entirely. "When he noticed the discrepancy, he offered to help resolve the matter discreetly. I thought he was being charitable, but then he began demanding payments to ensure his continued silence." Eleanor rose from her chair with sudden understanding, her own troubles momentarily forgotten in the face of this revelation. "The banker's draft, you were paying him to remain quiet about the missing candlesticks?" Mrs. Harwell nodded miserably. "The final payment, I hoped. He promised this would end his demands. But I feared he would never truly let the matter rest. Men like Westcott feed on others' desperation." Miss Marple found herself studying the photograph frame with renewed interest, particularly noting how its backing had been disturbed in several places. "Dr. Clement," she said conversationally, "when you examined this frame at Mr. Westcott's shop, did you notice anything unusual about its construction?" The young doctor's face showed the strain of maintaining deceptions that were rapidly unraveling. "Victorian frames sometimes contained secret compartments," he admitted reluctantly. Westcott was particularly skilled at discovering such features. He claimed this one held correspondence that could compromise several village families. Edgar Pike nodded enthusiastically. "Mr. Westcott spent weeks working on that frame, taking it apart and putting it back together. Said the mechanism was delicate, required special handling. But yesterday morning he seemed quite pleased about something and wrapped it up sudden-like." The implications of this revelation rippled through the assembled group with visible effect. Miss Marple observed how each person reacted differently, Eleanor with confusion rather than guilt, Dr. Clement with protective alarm, Mrs. Harwell with barely controlled panic. "There remains," Miss Marple observed mildly, "the curious matter of Mr. Westcott's pocket watch. It stopped at 23 minutes past 12. Yet Mrs. Bantry saw him quite clearly at 12:30, walking toward the lane with apparent purpose." Mrs. Harwell's eyes widened as if a new and terrible realization was taking root. "He mentioned the watch was unreliable," she whispered, "said it had been giving him trouble all week, stopping and starting without warning." Inspector Craddock made careful notes as the timeline complications became clear. If Westcott had been alive and active at 12:30, then the sequence of events leading to his death had occurred after Mrs. Harwell's payment arrangements. After Dr. Clement's confrontation at the shop, and after Eleanor's initial refusal to see him, Miss Marple settled back in her chair, her keen eyes moving from face to face as she absorbed the accumulating evidence. The brass key in her knitting bag, the secret compartment in the frame, the systematic nature of Westcott's exploitation, all pointed toward a truth more complex than simple murder motivated by individual desperation. "I believe," she said with gentle authority, "that we are dealing with something rather more intricate than a single moment of violence. Mr. Westcott's death appears to have been the culmination of multiple pressures, each person in this room having encountered his particular brand of exploitation." As the inspector prepared to delve deeper into these connections, Miss Marple reflected on the web of secrets and fears that Westcott had woven throughout the village. The man had been systematic in his predation, using his legitimate business to identify and exploit human vulnerability wherever he found it. The truth, she suspected, would require one final test of character to reveal which of the accumulated suspects had finally decided that Lionel Westcott's reign of exploitation had gone far enough. The lamplight cast long shadows across Charles Whitmore's study as Miss Marple rose from her chair with the deliberate movements of someone who had reached a crucial understanding. Her knitting needles clicked softly as she approached the window, gazing toward the garden gate that had troubled her sense of order from the very beginning of this unfortunate affair. "Inspector," she said with gentle authority, "I believe we should examine the scene once more, but this time with all the facts properly arranged. The evening air might help clarify certain inconsistencies that have been troubling me throughout our investigation." The suggestion, delivered with her characteristic mild courtesy, drew the assembled group back toward the garden path, where the gate stood in the mellow evening light. The green paint had dried to a dull sheen, and the mechanism's spring tension remained as Florrie had demonstrated earlier. Miss Marple positioned herself near the gate with the careful attention of someone conducting a vital experiment. "Dr. Clement," she began conversationally, "you mentioned that Mr. Westcott's pocket watch had been unreliable all week, stopping and starting without warning. Yet when we discovered his body, the watch showed 23 minutes past 12 with remarkable precision. Curious, don't you think? For such an unreliable timepiece to stop at such a specific moment." The young doctor's face showed the strain of maintaining composure under increasingly pointed scrutiny. "Mechanical failures can be unpredictable," he replied carefully, though his voice lacked conviction. "Indeed they can," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "Mrs. Bantry, you observed Mr. Westcott walking purposefully toward this lane at 12:30, appearing quite well and determined. That places him alive and active 7 minutes after his watch allegedly stopped. A remarkable feat for a deceased gentleman." Eleanor's eyes widened as the implication became clear. "You're suggesting the watch was deliberately stopped to mislead us about the time of death?" Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "Precisely, my dear. But stopping a pocket watch requires direct manipulation, opening the case, moving the hands, disrupting the mechanism. Such intimate handling suggests someone with both opportunity and knowledge of the deceased's habits." Inspector Craddock stepped forward with renewed attention. "Dr. Clement, you examined the body immediately after discovery. You would have had ample opportunity to manipulate the watch during your medical assessment. The accusation hung in the evening air like smoke." Dr. Clement's protective stance toward Eleanor faltered as he realized the web of evidence tightening around him. His fingers moved unconsciously to his jacket pocket, where the brass screw still rested as damning proof of his morning visit to Westcott's shop. Miss Marple approached the gate mechanism with scientific curiosity. "Florrie, would you demonstrate once more how you secured the gate this morning?" The young maid complied nervously, looping twine around the latch and post with a simple knot that held the gate barely ajar. Miss Marple tested the tension thoughtfully, then turned to Dr. Clement with mild interest. "Doctor, your medical training would include considerable knowledge of knots and fastenings, would it not? Surgical sutures require precise technique, and bandages must be secured against considerable stress." Dr. Clement's face had gone pale, but he stepped forward with automatic precision. "A proper medical knot requires a double throw," he demonstrated, his fingers moving with practiced skill to create a much more secure fastening. "It prevents slippage under tension." "Excellent," Miss Marple observed, studying the improved knot with apparent admiration. "Inspector, you'll notice how this fastening lies flat against the post, nearly invisible to casual observation. Now, observe what happens when such a knot is severed at precisely the right moment." She drew a small pair of embroidery scissors from her knitting bag and positioned them against the twine. "Imagine Mr. Westcott standing just here, his back to the garden, examining something on the wall or adjusting his hat. A person inside the garden, unseen behind the hedge, could easily reach through and cut this string at the crucial moment." The demonstration proved devastating in its simplicity. When Miss Marple severed the twine, the gate snapped shut with considerable force, its iron latch striking the post with a sharp crack that made everyone present flinch. "The spring mechanism provides all the necessary force," she explained gently. "A heavy iron gate striking the back of a gentleman's head would certainly prove sufficient to cause fatal injury, particularly if the victim's skull subsequently contacted the stone wall during his fall." Dr. Clement's composure finally cracked entirely. "I was protecting Eleanor," he burst out, his voice thick with desperation. "Westcott was destroying her life with his threats and manipulations. When I discovered at his shop that he was merely bluffing with empty frames and blank papers, I realized he had no real evidence against anyone. He was feeding on fear and suggestion alone." Eleanor stepped back from him with horror and understanding. "You followed him here. You waited for him to arrive, then?" "I positioned myself behind the hedge," Dr. Clement continued, his confession pouring out like water from a broken dam. "When he paused at the gate to examine the fresh paint, I cut the string. It was meant to appear accidental, a tragic mishap with a faulty gate mechanism." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle clicking as she absorbed this revelation. "The brass screw in your pocket came from dismantling the photograph frame at Westcott's shop. You discovered his bluff was complete, no compromising letters, no damaging evidence, merely the systematic exploitation of human fear and vulnerability." Inspector Craddock made careful notes as the full scope of Dr. Clement's deception became clear. The manipulated pocket watch, the carefully staged accident, the protective facade that masked personal motivation all pointed to premeditated murder, disguised as misfortune. "The green paint on your hands didn't come from casual contact with the gate," Miss Marple observed with gentle finality. "It came from positioning the mechanism precisely, ensuring the latch would strike with maximum force. Your medical knowledge provided both the means and the method." As P.C. Lake stepped forward to make the arrest, Eleanor sank onto a garden bench with the terrible realization that her protector had become her destroyer. The man who claimed to act from love had committed murder in her name, staining both their reputations with blood that could never be washed clean. Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony as the evening shadows lengthened around Rosemary Lodge. Lionel Westcott's predatory exploitation had indeed been stopped, but at a cost that transformed victim into accomplice and protector into predator. The gate that had troubled her sense of order from the beginning had indeed been the key to the entire mystery, not because it was left ajar by accident, but because it had been deliberately converted into an instrument of death by someone who understood both its mechanism and its potential for violence. The village would return to its peaceful routine, but with the knowledge that even the most noble intentions could lead to the darkest of deeds, when fear and desperation overcame moral restraint. The evening shadows had deepened considerably by the time P.C. Lake's footsteps faded down the lane, taking Dr. Clement away from Rosemary Lodge forever. Eleanor remained seated on the garden bench, her hands folded in her lap with the careful stillness of someone afraid that any movement might shatter what remained of her carefully ordered world. The abandoned fete decorations fluttered mockingly in the gentle breeze, their cheerful colors now seeming garish against the gravity of what had transpired. Inspector Craddock approached Miss Marple with the respectful attention he had learned to accord her insights. "I confess, Miss Marple, your demonstration with the gate mechanism was quite remarkable. How did you first suspect Dr. Clement's involvement?" Miss Marple settled her knitting bag more comfortably, her needles clicking with thoughtful rhythm. "It began with small inconsistencies, Inspector. The paint on his hands showed deliberate handling rather than casual contact. Then there was his passionate defense of Eleanor's innocence, too immediate, too forceful, as if he were convincing himself as much as us." She paused to observe Eleanor, who sat motionless beside the gate that had been converted into an instrument of death. But the crucial evidence was the brass screw in his pocket. When he claimed it had merely fallen there during Westcott's demonstration, I realized he had systematically dismantled the photograph frame to discover Westcott's deception. Finding only blank letterhead and empty threats, he became emboldened rather than relieved. Eleanor's voice, when she finally spoke, carried the hollow tone of profound disillusionment. "I never asked him to protect me. If I had known what his devotion would lead to, I would have faced whatever scandal Westcott threatened rather than see an innocent man destroyed. Love can be a dangerous emotion when it becomes possessive rather than protective," Miss Marple observed gently. "Dr. Clement convinced himself he was acting in your best interests, but his actions were ultimately selfish. He couldn't bear to witness your suffering, regardless of your own wishes." Mrs. Harwell, who had remained quietly in the background throughout the final revelations, stepped forward with renewed composure. The resolution of Dr. Clement's guilt had lifted the immediate threat to her own secret, though the shame of her circumstances remained. "Inspector," she said with careful dignity, "regarding the church matter, I shall confess everything to my husband tonight and arrange immediate restitution. Edgar can accompany your constable to Merrick and Sons tomorrow to recover the candlesticks. Confession freely given is always received more charitably than discovery forced upon us. The vicar is a good man who understands human frailty." Edgar Pike, eager to contribute positively after the afternoon's revelations, confirmed his willingness to assist with recovering the pawned items. His testimony would also prove crucial in exposing the full extent of Westcott's predatory business practices throughout the district. As the remaining fete guests departed with subdued farewells, Miss Marple found herself alone with Eleanor beside the infamous gate. The widow's fingers traced the fresh green paint with the gentle touch of someone saying farewell to a cherished possession that had been forever tainted by tragedy. "Will they always think I encouraged him?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Some will speculate, because people must make sense of extraordinary events," Miss Marple replied with characteristic honesty. "But those who truly know you will remember that you always kept this gate properly closed. It took someone very determined to convert it into a weapon." Eleanor's eyes filled with unshed tears. "Every time I pass this gate, I'll remember what happened here." "Then oil the hinges yourself tomorrow morning," Miss Marple suggested with gentle practicality. "Put it right. Routine is the best remedy for painful memories." As the last of the evening light faded, Miss Marple made her way slowly down the lane toward her own cottage. Behind her, Rosemary Lodge stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, its windows glowing warmly despite the tragedy that had unfolded in its peaceful garden. The village would recover, as villages always did, with careful stitches of kindness and deliberate patches of silence where needed. But for some time to come, more than one careful hand would ensure their garden gates were properly secured, and more than one resident would reflect on the dangerous currents that could flow beneath the surface of even the most tranquil communities. In her neat sitting room, Miss Marple settled into her favorite chair and resumed her knitting, the familiar rhythm of the needles providing comfort after the afternoon's disturbing revelations. She reflected on Lionel Westcott's systematic exploitation of human vulnerability and how it had ultimately destroyed not only himself, but also the man who had tried to stop him through violence rather than justice. The brass key still rested in her knitting bag, a small reminder that secrets, once unlocked, could never be secured again. Dr. Clement had discovered that Westcott's power lay not in actual evidence, but in the fear of exposure itself, a revelation that should have freed his victims, but instead had driven him to commit the very crime he had sought to prevent. As the church bells chimed the hour across the sleeping village, Miss Marple considered the eternal mysteries of human nature that no amount of detection could ever fully solve. The widow who had left her gate ajar had learned that protection sometimes came at too high a price, and that the most dangerous enemies were often those who claimed to act from love. Now, generate the final section of the story, ensuring a satisfying resolution. Maintain the logical progression of clues and character arcs, delivering the final reveal smoothly, while keeping the ending impactful and true to the detective's style. 3 weeks after the tragic events at Rosemary Lodge, Miss Marple made her morning constitutional through street. Mary Mead with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had witnessed a community's remarkable capacity for healing. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and the promise of winter's approach, while the village had settled back into its comfortable rhythms with the resilience that characterized English country life. Eleanor Whitmore's garden gate now swung smoothly on well-oiled hinges, its fresh green paint gleaming in the morning sunlight. More significantly, the widow had planted a border of winter roses along the path where Lionel Westcott had fallen, a living memorial that would bloom each year as a testament to renewal rather than tragedy. Eleanor herself appeared at her front door, collecting the Morning Post with movements that suggested peace rather than the haunted anxiety that had marked her demeanor during those difficult days. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Eleanor called with genuine warmth. "The inspector telephoned yesterday with news that Mr. Westcott's criminal network extended far beyond our village. Apparently, your evidence helped recover stolen items from dozens of families across 3 counties. Miss Marple paused at the gate, noting how Eleanor's fingers no longer worried at her handbag clasp with nervous energy. "Justice served, even if it came at such a terrible cost," she replied gently. "How are you managing, my dear?" "Better than I expected," Eleanor admitted, her voice carrying hard-won wisdom. "Dr. Hawthorne from Much Benham has been most professional in his care, and I've learned that accepting help doesn't require the sort of devotion that poor Dr. Clement believed necessary." The church bells chimed the hour as Miss Marple continued her walk, passing the vicarage where Mrs. Harwell was polishing the recovered Georgian candlesticks on the front step. The vicar's wife had confessed everything to her husband, as promised, and the parish had responded with the compassionate understanding that Miss Marple had predicted. The quarterly accounts now bore a notation, acknowledging the temporary loan and its resolution, transforming shame into a testament to community support. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Harwell called, setting down her polishing cloth. "I wanted to thank you again for your guidance during that dreadful affair. The bishop's visit went splendidly. He particularly admired our candlesticks and commented on their excellent preservation. At the post office, Mrs. Fallon mentioned that Edgar Pike had established himself as an honest dealer in Much Benham, having inherited Westcott's legitimate business while cooperating fully with authorities to expose the criminal elements. Young Pike's testimony had proven crucial in prosecuting the network of accomplices who had helped Westcott systematically exploit grieving families throughout the district. Miss Marple reflected on these developments as she settled into her favorite armchair that afternoon, her knitting needles clicking with their familiar rhythm. The pattern she worked, a complex design of interlocking cables, reminded her of the intricate connections between human motivations that made village life both fascinating and occasionally dangerous. Clement's trial had proceeded swiftly, his full confession and cooperation earning him a reduced sentence that acknowledged both his crime and his genuine remorse. The medical board had revoked his license permanently, but his testimony had helped authorities understand the psychological manipulation that Westcott had employed against his victims. The brass key that had unlocked so many secrets now rested in official hands, but its discovery had taught Miss Marple something profound about the nature of protection and possession. Dr. Clement had believed that love justified any action taken in its name, but true affection required respecting the autonomy and wishes of its object rather than imposing one's own vision of safety. As evening shadows lengthened across the village green, Miss Marple considered the eternal mysteries of human nature that no amount of detection could ever fully solve. Lionel Westcott's predatory exploitation had indeed been stopped, but the vulnerabilities he had targeted, grief, shame, financial desperation, remained as permanent features of the human condition. Yet there was profound hope in the community's response to revelation. The parish had embraced confession with forgiveness, Eleanor had chosen growth over retreat, and the village itself had demonstrated that trust, once broken, could be carefully rebuilt through patience and understanding. The widow's gate stood properly closed now, its mechanism restored to reliable function. But Miss Marple knew that somewhere in Street Mary Mead, another secret was taking root. Another mystery was developing. Another test of human nature was quietly preparing itself for discovery. Such was the eternal cycle of village life, as predictable as the seasons, as complex as the most intricate knitting pattern, and as endlessly revealing as the hearts that beat within even the most ordinary-seeming members of any peaceful English community. The case was closed, but life continued with all its beautiful and terrible possibilities intact.